Hello, I'm Joseph Garcia, and I will be discussing the Meyer versus Nebraska case. We will begin with some context. Before this case happened, World War I was taking place, in which it spanned from 1914 to 1921. This war had placed the Central Powers against the Allies. The Central Powers had consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, and the Allies had consisted of France, Great Britain, Russia, Italy, Japan, and the United States. With the fear arising from the war, a nativist sentiment had begun to spread around the country, in which the US population had begun to push for a homogeneous population in which everyone spoke the same language, which was English. As you can see on the propaganda to the right, it was believed that anyone who spoke outside of the English language was speaking in the enemy's tongue. And with this fear and backlash, the Simmons Act of 1919 had been enacted. The Simmons Act is a Nebraska enacted law which states that no private, denominational, parochial, or public school could teach in any language other than English. And in the case the foreign languages be taught, they could only be taught once the children had passed the 8th grade, and any violation of this law would result in a misdemeanor and a fine of $25 to $100, or confinement in county jail for up to 30 days. Now we will move on to how this case came about. It starts at Zion Parochial School, in which Robert Meyer was an instructor, and was caught teaching Raymond Parpart, a 10-year-old, about the subject of reading in the German language. This occurred on May 25th of 1920. Once he was found teaching the German language, he was then tried and convicted for a violation of the Nebraska Simmons Act. His Supreme Court case was then argued on February 23rd of 1923, and the ruling was decided on June 4th, 1923. When Meyer was asked why he continued to teach German, he argued that he had a duty to uphold, in which he believed that this duty would include teaching children the religion of their fathers and the language of their fathers, so that they could understand his religious teachings to the fullest extent. Now, when faced with the validity of the Simmons Act, Nebraska would claim that this was necessary to accelerate the assimilation of the immigrant children and their rate of learning English. They believed that requiring that only English be taught from until the 8th grade would help accelerate this. And so, once they passed the 8th grade, only then would they be able to learn or speak their mother tongue. Additionally, to argue this case, the Supreme Court of the state argued that the law was not in conflict with the 14th Amendment, and that it was simply a valid use of the state's police power, which is an inherent power given to the states to use reasonable force and law that does not conflict with the people's right to regulate their population. And now for the ruling of this case, the Supreme Court had ruled that the Simmons Act was a violation to the 14th Amendment, which in specific the Due Process Clause. They had ruled that this law had violated Meyer's rights. However, we'll get into those specific rights in the later slides. They ruled that this law had exceeded the limitations placed upon the state's power that are there to prevent conflict with any of the people's rights. In the rulings, it was additionally noted that the reasoning and aspiration behind the Simmons Act was understandable given the circumstances of the events that happened during this time and during the late war. Because, as stated previously, this war had pitted the Central Powers against the Allies, which would include Germany against the United States, causing much of this fear and backlash to occur. And now we will talk about the case's impact. At the time, this case had marked the first national law that tackled bilingualism and the education of the language minoritized. As per the textbook, it had extended the protection of the Constitution to everyday speech and prohibited coercive language restriction on the part of states. Overall, this case had defined the right to teach in any language as a given right. However, despite its best efforts, the nativist spree had left its impression upon the society already, leaving that European immigrants had felt this pressure to assimilate, bilingual education had dissipated, leaving it virtually eradicated at this time, and that any darker-skinned immigrants had faced discrimination and cultural repression. And now in our current state, the Meyer versus Nebraska case had still set a landmark that had created a path for future laws, because as we stated, it defined that teaching in any language was a given right. And so this path had had helped build for had built a path for the later acts that to come, which included the Bilingual Education Act of 1968, and this act had been revived and resourced throughout the very many years of the history. This act had encouraged funding programs for low-income and language minoritized populations. However, this case is also known for holding a legacy of establishing the United States as an English-speaking country for children of all mother tongues, which means that despite the benefits of this case, the case also set a precedent that the United States was could be defined as an English-speaking only country, with English as its main language. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Here is my list of references used in this presentation, and here is a list of my image sources from this presentation. Once again, thank you for listening.